And I worked with a lot of older kids, junior high and high school kids. And I can tell you from experience, the vast majority of Christian junior high and high school kids are not equipped to be salt and light. And what happens is because they're not equipped, they end up being influenced by the culture of the school or the students around them rather than influencing others. Well, we've got a big event coming up in March, Erin. Huge event. Huge. I can't do an impersonation. No, big event. Our annual Maven Conference is coming up on March 18th through 19th with a special pre-conference event on March the 17th. So if you are a listener to the podcast and you find the podcast helpful, you are going to love the conference because the conference is like 1,000 times better than the podcast.
Jeez.
Podcast is horrible compared to the conference.
Oh my gosh. I was thinking more of saying like, don't you want to come out to Southern California and visit us here and come to the conference?
And come stay in our home and we'll prepare you meals.
Well, we have a small house, but we do have a couple couches, as you can see if you're watching behind us.
That's not even an option. Just sorry, folks. It's not an option. No, but the Maven Conference is a conference that is for adults. It's for anyone really who is a stakeholder in the lives of young people who are investing. So it could be parents, it could be grandparents, it could be educators, homeschoolers, administrators, youth workers, youth pastors, pastors. I mean, really anybody who is involved in the lives of young people. So this year's conference theme is in, but not of. How do we live in this world, but not absorb the ideas and the worldview, the values of this world? How do we navigate it wisely? We're going to hit issues like freedom. I mean, I don't think a lot of Christians feel equipped with a solid biblical view of freedom, what freedom is, what the proper view of freedom is, how do we advocate for proper freedom in a society like ours. That's a huge issue over the last couple of years. We're going to be talking about marriage and family, and the changing structure of marriage and family and what it does, particularly to children. We're going to talk about the issue of racial strife, and looking at the world's view on this and a biblical view. And we're going to be hitting all kinds of different breakout sessions and just a great group of speakers, from J. Warner Wallace to Thaddeus Williams, Katie Faust, John Stonestreet, you, Erin, Natasha Crane, Jonathan Morrow. We just added Monique Dusson. And gosh, it's going to be a great lineup. So anyway, this is a conference that is worth traveling to. It's worth giving a weekend to and investing in. And some of you parents need to get away anyway. And what better place to come than Southern California?
I think too, if you can come as mom and dad and maybe grandparents,
get a couple families together.
Yeah, I do think, like when we've gone to conferences together, we've always enjoyed that because it's so hard. And when you go, just one of you to come back and reiterate everything that was said, it's hard to. So when you get to learn together, it's so great. We've always loved learning together. So just that encouragement too. If you can pull it off as a couple, it's definitely worth the effort to get the babysitters, the kids covered, and sometimes you think of doing things and you're like, there's so many hoops to jump through. Are you serious? You want us to come to this conference? And yes, we know the hoops that you have to jump through as parents, but it's good to learn together.
Yeah. We know you'll be encouraged. You'll be challenged. You'll be equipped.
Yeah.
Year after year after year. This is our fourth conference, and we just get great response. It's very encouraging because parents need to be equipped with just a Christian worldview in navigating this. So, all right, go to mavenconferences.com, mavenconferences.com, and you'll find all the information about the upcoming Maven Conference. So we hope to see some of you guys there.
Okay, so that leads well into the question that we are going to answer today, a question that we've gotten many times. But the question is, why do you homeschool? And the person went on to say, public school needs your children. They can be salt and light.
This is actually my question to Erin. And why do you homeschool?
First of all, what strikes me about the question, public school needs your children. They can be salt and light. That assumes our children would bring light and salt to the public school. What if they bring darkness and chaos?
And your kids certainly would.
Maybe we're saving the public school. No, I'm just kidding. But it's a compliment that they would think our kids would do that. But this question of why do you homeschool? We do homeschool. We decided to homeschool our kids many years ago. And so we thought today we'd answer that question since it is one that we get often.
Now let's clarify from the beginning, Erin. I'll offer a clarification question. Not only why do you homeschool, but do you also think everyone else should homeschool?
Well, you think we should answer that? That's always been a funny question to me too, because when I find out someone's kids are in private school, I don't then take that next leap and say, and then do you think everyone's kids should be in private school? It just kind of strikes me as odd. And when our kids were in public school, I never got the question like, oh, do you think all kids should be in public school? Like, do you judge the people whose kids are in private school? It's like, no, why would I even have an opinion necessarily on how other families are deciding about their kids' education? Now, I can have ideas about education and, of course, have lots of feelings about what our families decided to do. But it does strike me that also follow-up question is one that only homeschoolers get. As if once we homeschool, now we're making a statement about how we think everyone else ought to do their schooling.
Well, we do feel like we've reached a level of enlightenment that other parents haven't. And so maybe that's what it is. Yeah, no, I think there can be so much maybe baggage that we bring into this conversation. There can be defensive-ness. And so I think up front wanted to let people know, hey, we've actually done all three. We've done public school. We've had kids in public school. We've had kids in private school, and we've homeschooled. Mm-hmm. So we have experience with all of them. We don't think there is a one size fits all. We know that some families are not in a position to do one or the other. And so no judgment here, but at the same time, we want to lay out the reasons why we were convinced to do this. And at the very least, we want everyone to think carefully about the nature of education and the education of our kids. And so there are going to be challenges in all three.
Yeah. Well, and so just to start off, I guess it is good to clarify, and as I mentioned, when our kids were in public school, we didn't ever get some of these questions. So that leads to the fact that we actually started our kids in public school. And so we've done public school, like you said, we've done private school, and we've done homeschooling. So part of our story of answering the question, why do you homeschool, was a story with our oldest daughter. Of course, your first kid is your guinea pig. We've said this before many times. So your oldest kid is what you do all the first things with.
That's why your oldest kid needs the most therapy.
And so we did public school all through elementary school. And then around 5th, 6th grade was the first time for us that we started thinking about the possibility of even doing something different. And this was a new idea for us because I had always gone to public school. You had done public school and some private school. Mm-hmm. But the idea of homeschooling was never a thought in my mind to to try. And frankly, I had a lot of prejudice towards it. I mean, we weren't Amish, so I didn't think homeschooling was an option. And, I really had some terrible prejudice towards.
Well, you've been a judgmental person for most of your life, Erin.
Gosh.
So
why am I always the one confessing sin on this podcast? So anyway.
Because I'm sinless?
So I had a lot of misconceptions about homeschooling. I thought, the whole thing of deciding to do it meant you wanted to live not in but not of. Like you wanted to live out and not of, like out of society. And so it just wasn't on my mind. I just never considered it. So
we had some of those stereotypes.
Yeah. So what kind of came to a head was just seeing how the culture of the school was starting to have an effect on our daughter the older she got, especially we're seeing this more and more. And then there was a 6th grade trip that was coming up, and I tried to be as involved in the school as I could be. We had little ones too, so I was limited, but I would go and help in class, and I would go to the PTA meetings and volunteer for as much as I could. So I went to a meeting, and they were talking about the 6th grade trip, and they didn't have a male chaperone that they needed. And you, Brett, weren't at that meeting. And that was unfortunate for you because I actually volunteered you to be the male chaperone that they needed. And so when I came home, I said, honey, you are going to not believe what you get to do in a couple of weeks. You get to go to science camp with a bunch of 6th graders.
Yeah. And see, I had the opposite view where Erin tried to do as much as she could to help out. I was trying to do as little as I could to help out. And so maybe that's what it was a form of punishment.
Well, you were a youth pastor. I knew you would be fine. And they needed a chaperone. And I thought it would be.
Yeah. And they were talking about hiring.
Yes.
They were talking about hiring like a substitute teacher to go. And of course we're like, no, a dad needs to go. So I was willing to go. And
so tell us about that 6th grade science camp.
Well, I'm not sure I'm ready yet to talk about it. It was traumatic. I got to stay with the boys. So I was with the boys as a chaperone, and I didn't really know the boys a lot. So it wasn't like I had this great relationship with them and they wanted to hang out with me all the time. So I ended up being kind of a fly on the wall a lot. And I interact with the boys, try to build some relationship, but they kind of doing their thing at science camp. And they didn't, it wasn't a whole lot of role for me is beyond like, just don't let the boys kill each other. But so I remember being kind of this fly on the wall and just watching the way that these 6th grade boys interacted with each other. And I remember how they would just verbally attack each other and rip on each other. And I remember walking away thinking, hey, this is like a Darwinian situation. Mm-hmm. This is a survival of the fittest situation. And the weak get preyed on and the stronger survive. And the stronger meaning the more popular, the athletic, the cool kids, whatever. And then, then on the outskirts are the weaker kids who are, less, they have less social capital, for whatever reason. Yeah. And I just watched the way these kids interacted with each other, and they're just surrounded by, it was like 15 or so little 6th grade boys, seemingly to be narcissists, and it just was this crew. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh. If this is what our daughter's around from 8 in the morning until 2:30 in the afternoon, Monday through Friday, boy, that is a lot of time spent in that environment that no wonder we're seeing certain attitudes and behaviors begin to emerge in her.
Yeah, I think for us, it was not as if both of us grew up going to school. It's not as if this was completely foreign, but I think what we started to realize that as the culture was changing, so was the culture in the schools. And that was something, at least for me, I hadn't really connected. And what was interesting is around this same time, I don't know if you remember, but I was asked to chaperone a high school dance at a local high school. And I think it was close to the time of this. And I came home from chaperoning that high school dance. And I was so upset by what I saw at just a local public high school dance that it took me several days actually to kind of recover from it in a sense of just feeling so grievous for how bad things had declined from when we were in high school. And just, I didn't realize, even though we were in youth ministry, I didn't realize what was happening. And so all of these things just started to make us think about if we wanted to just continue on this road of public school with our kids. And thinking about our kids individually, too, was a part of it. And is this something that our kids can kind of handle being in this kind of environment?
Well, I think, that question was kind of answered because what prompted it.
Yeah.
We're feeling like, gosh, there are things emerging in our kid that we're not happy with, whether it's an attitude or a particular view, or interactions with siblings, or those kind of things. So there was a number of indicators saying, no, they can't handle it. Mm-hmm. That kind of pressure situation when you're way outnumbered.
Yeah.
And that's how we're so influenced, just being around those things. And it doesn't matter whether you're an adult or a kid. You put yourself in a particular environment for enough time, and that environment will have an impact on you. It's it's the rare individual. Now, sometimes when you're an adult, you have a certain amount of maybe moral strength and courage and that kind of thing that you can resist some of that. But certainly when you're still in this very formative stage where you're still trying to root your identity and figure out what your identity is in, and you are just subject to the shifting views and patterns and habits and thoughts of kind of that peer group. So
yeah. So this whole experience, and there were several things that were kind of happening in a short period of time. Also, what happened too is we started to stumble upon people who were homeschooling that, lo and behold, were not Amish and lived in our community and seemed to be normal, which was, for me, what needed to happen, because I needed to shatter these prejudices that I did have. And what we started to see in these families we were meeting and people we were starting to get to know is that their kids seemed quite different than a lot of the students that we had worked with in
You better
youth
define
ministry.
quite different, because when it comes to homeschooling kids being quite different, someone out there might take that
What
not
do you
the way
mean
you
different?
intended.
Yeah, well, okay, one thing I noticed, and again, just having young people in our lives a lot with our kids' friends and then in youth work, was that these kids looked me in the eye when I was talking to them. They seemed genuinely interested in conversation. They seemed to have an closeness with their family that I didn't, it was pretty rare to see. Mm-hmm. So there were things like that. That's what I mean by different things that stood out to me right away.
It was a good different.
It was definitely a good different.
Yeah.
So this sent us on a journey of finally being open-minded about what we might do, and then sent us on a journey to really think about education from a Christian worldview, which we had not done as parents. And so that led to a whole, years now. I still read every year some book or go to some conference, or I'm always still even learning about the Christian view of education and how to keep developing that in my own mind. So it's been a journey, but that's how it all kind of started.
Yeah, and I think it wasn't this neat, clean process of us knowing very clearly from the get-go, hey, here is a biblical view of education, and then here's how we are going to best accomplish this as a family. Mm-hmm. We have been socialized to just, kind of assume that the typical methods and patterns and habits were just what you do. Yeah. And so I don't think we had given it a lot of thought ourselves. And even if we had maintained our kid in public school, still needing to be very clear on, hey, what is the purpose of education? What is education from a biblical view? And how do we best accomplish that wherever we're at? So it wasn't like we said, here's our view, and now let's move forward. It was a lot of stumbling and kind of falling down, and over time, just honing our view. And now we would say, okay, we think we have our minds wrapped around a biblical view of education. Mm-hmm. And that and the biblical view of education can be carried out in the public, private, or homeschool setting. Mm-hmm. But given what your goals are and your vision of education is, one of those one method or one environment might be a little more conducive to what you're trying to accomplish. And so those are the things that you have to weigh. But yeah, I guess I highlight that because it hasn't been like this neat, clean journey. It's a messy journey. Mm-hmm. And it was a dawning realization that we wanted to go in a different route than we had been going.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think actually what you're saying, and I would just maybe add that you can do, once you really do develop a view of education that is a Christian view, then like you said, you can continue to do all three options. But I think knowing that sometimes an option that we choose, or some of the things that we're offered in our culture as far as options for our kids, might actually be stumbling blocks to what we want to accomplish as far as their education.
Yeah, and that we're gonna have to weigh those things. Mm-hmm. I mean, just maybe a real simple illustration of this is, of course, I think in the Christian view of education, one area of knowledge that's absolutely vital is theology. Right, our knowledge of God. Passing on a knowledge of God and who He is absolutely central to a Christian view of education. Okay, obviously, if your kid is in public school, that's not going to be supplemented there. It's not going to be taught there. It's sometimes it's going to be, public education is going to mitigate against your view on God, and so that's just going to present a unique challenge that you're going to have to figure out how to overcome and deal with. So that would be kind of a real practical way to say, here's one area where, this form is going to offer some challenges. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you're a homeschooler and maybe by the time your kids are in high school, you want them to be you want them to be evangelistic. You might have to be a little more intentional in making sure that there is some exposure to unbelievers, mm-hmm. right? So those are the things that you have to consider. Yeah. So what is our view of education now? Have we settled?
Well, we've done a whole seminar on this topic, so we could talk about it for a long time. But I think, the three kind of main pillars of education from a Christian worldview that we have learned and been able to think through and articulate now in our own minds, and then with each other, with our kids, and with other people, is these three areas: that there is the spiritual part of education, the moral part of education, and then the intellectual part of education. And not that those don't all three blend together, because they do, but just to kind of talk through it and break it up, I think that's what we would do.
Yeah, those are broad categories that are helpful. I think in a nutshell, we would say, if someone were to ask, what is education? We'd say education is the formation of the whole person. Mm-hmm. right? It's the formation of the whole person. And what we found was that a lot of education in any of those kind of settings, public, private, homeschool, can be overly focused on just the academic. But in a Christian view, the formation of the whole person, academically or intellectually, that's vital and important. Morally, what you see throughout Scripture is a connection between our beliefs and our moral life. You see this throughout. I mean, Romans chapter 1 is a great example of this, where there's a denial of certain truths about God. There's a suppression of truth in sin, in unrighteousness. And so we see there's this interplay between those things. And that false ideas have a direct connection to immorality. So, and then there's the if you want to call it the spiritual, our relationship with Christ, all of that together. And I mean, you could divide the categories up into other areas, but that just a kind of a brief sketch would be the formation of the whole person. Mm-hmm. And that's the goal of education. And so, yes, we are concerned about what our kids learn, what kind of knowledge that they're acquiring, but we're also just as concerned about their moral life. And I think if we look back on our own story, it was those moral concerns that really drove us to start rethinking education. Because we knew, whether we could articulate it back then, we knew that the moral component was absolutely vital. Mm-hmm. And now I think we're to the point where the way we would articulate it to our own kids is to say, look, you could have all the academic success that the world would look at and ooh and ah, and you could be that, you could go to whatever Ivy League school is, at the top of your list, and you could do your MBA at Harvard, or go to, Yale Law School or wherever, and become a successful person afterwards in terms of your career. And yet, if you have walked away from Christ, if you're living a corrupt lifestyle, we wouldn't be satisfied with that. We would be more satisfied if you never went on to college. If our kids were at a job that was considered, less prominent, less significant, they were a clerk at a local store, right? But they were following Jesus with all their heart, and were faithful to him and serving him, that we would be much more satisfied with that. So that's the view of education. We've actually done some podcasts on this where we lay out in more detail, so we don't want to talk too much more about that, but go back to some past episodes, and I can't remember the titles of them off the top of my head.
I think it was just a Christian view of education.
Something like that. Okay.
But yeah, I think those two podcasts, we talk about these three things a lot and go into it more. So that is what was our springboard into why we chose to homeschool. And so what about this objection, Brett? The objection that we've gotten many times is that, hey, the public school needs your kids. Mm-hmm. If all the Christians pull out their kids, now what are we going to do? Yeah. And that we need the culture needs our kids in the public school to be salt and light.
Yeah. Well, I would say this. Number one, the culture does need us to be salt and light. But where we are salt and light is a separate question. And so there are different things we have to weigh. First, as a parent, my primary obligation is to disciple my kids. That's one of my primary obligations. And of course, as a follower of Christ, I'm to fulfill the Great Commission, right? Partner with the Holy Spirit in the Great Commission. So you've got two obligations there. And yet you have to use wisdom in this. Mm-hmm. And you don't have any explicit statements in Scripture that say your kids need to be salt and light. It's just believers need to be salt and light. So number one, a lot of our young people, when they are 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 years old, they're not actually believers yet. They, whatever your view is on an age of accountability, or, most of the kids at that age maybe haven't put their trust in Christ. And even if they have put their trust in Christ, they don't have a solid foundation yet. And you don't send unequipped or ill-equipped soldiers into battle, right? I'm obviously using an analogy here. We would never say, hey, we're in this war and we need to fight. We need to vanquish this enemy to preserve our country. And so, all right, you, all these citizens, let's go. No, what you're going to do first is equip and prepare them for that battle. And so most of our kids are not equipped to be salt and light. And that's just, I mean, that should be a pretty obvious observation. Now, can our kids at times be salt and light? Absolutely. I'm not saying they can't. I'm saying in general, most are not equipped. And I've worked with a lot of older kids, junior high and high school kids. And I can tell you from experience, the vast majority of Christian junior high and high school kids are not equipped to be salt and light. And what happens is because they're not equipped, they end up being influenced by the culture of the school or the students around them rather than influencing others. So it's like if you kept sending your soldiers into battle and they were just getting mowed down and mowed down and mowed down, at what point do you stop and say, okay, this strategy is not working. Let's regather, let's regroup and figure out a different strategy. And so there are times when you might say there's a battlefront here that's lost and we need to figure out a different strategy. So it might be, hey, there's so much momentum in a certain institution that we have to rethink our strategy in that institution. And there's so much cultural momentum and there's so much influence of pop culture, and that there might be a point where you have to remove kids from those environments in order to prepare them for that long-term battle of being salt and light, because it's not merely a matter of being salt and light in the school for the short amount of years they're going to be there, especially if that whole system undermines your kids' witness. And I mean, frankly, just talking to most parents, I almost never hear any parents tell us like, oh yeah, my kid is just such a powerful influence on their peers. They're such salt and light. Hey, if you have that kid, great, then maybe that kid should be in public school because the Lord's using them in very powerful ways. But I think it's pretty clear that's the rare exception. And so this is why you have to, you have to make the decision on your own. Mm-hmm. For most parents out there, what we hear is there are all these social pressures from technology to smartphones to social media to sexuality to the trans issue, the LGBTQ issue. There's all of these areas of pressure, mm-hmm. and my kid is not resisting it. My kid is being influenced. Mm-hmm. And so if that's the case, what the truth is, most kids are not being salt and light. Most kids are not ready to be salt and light. They need preparation. Mm-hmm. And so what we've talked about a lot is how our short-term goal, one of our short-term goals for our kids has been in homeschooling has been to protect them. We're trying to protect them, but not just protect them so there's an environment where we can train them properly. Think about it. Going back to that military analogy, where do Marines go when they're going to get trained? They don't stay at home and get trained at home, and every day leave their house and go meet up with a sergeant or whatever and do training. No, they go away. There's some protection, right? They go to Camp Pendleton down the road here in Southern California. They go to the Marine base and they spend the initial 8 weeks of training. And there's training that happens before they are ever put into battle. So I think that puts a proper perspective on the salt and light objection. Yeah. Hey, if you've got one of those outstanding kids that's been salt and light, God bless you. Be thankful for that. And have your kid be salt and light in their school.
Well, it strikes me, a couple things about what you're saying and about the question. One is, that for most kids, what you're saying, even if our kids come to faith, and some of our kids have at a very young age, they're still, like you were saying, it's what we would call, like in the Christian world, we'll say someone's a baby Christian when they've just come to faith, And so with someone who's just a new believer, would we put them in an environment where daily they're challenged in their faith and at such a young age? And would we expect that would bring about a good for them kind of thing? It also strikes me too, so what I'm saying is just that could be so overwhelming, the amount of time, which you talked about.
And it's going to be different for an adult than a kid.
Of course, yeah.
Because, and that's what we're looking at is a kid.
Yes.
Because an adult who maybe comes to faith when they're 40, well, they're going to have to go back to work, and they might be, in a bad environment. But even for that adult, there might be an environment they say, okay, I'm not ready for this. I need to pull out of it.
Well, I'm thinking as an adult, there are things that affect me, like being on social media. There's so many studies about girls, but women. Mm-hmm. And so we are influenced by what we spend our time in, even mature Christians. Yep. And so even thinking of it that way is kind of can be illuminating to how we're thinking about our kids being salt and light. It also strikes me too that the public school is not the only place that our kids can be a part of the culture with peers, having friends, and be an influence. Mm-hmm. When we decided to homeschool, we actually didn't decide to lock our kids in the house. We've let them participate in all kinds of things. We can make a whole page list full of extracurricular activities that our kids have been in.
Let's list some of those so people have an idea. What are specific things that we've done?
Like swimming, soccer, basketball, volleyball, track, football.
That's just on the athletic side.
That's just the athletic side. They've done dance and choir and plays,
art classes,
and art and
music lessons.
So yes, and then of course we live in a neighborhood, and again we haven't locked our kids in the house. So it turns out there's other kids that live in our neighborhood, and then we attend church, and so there's kids. So there's
a lot of lost kids at church.
Well, I guess I'm thinking community, but anyway, so just the idea that school's the only place, so that if we as Christians remove our kids from the public school, that there's no way they can in any way make friendships with non-Christians, just strikes me as a little bit crazy, because of course they can still have friendships, and our kids have, and still do. And so that's just a regular part of our life. What is different is just that it's not every 5 days a week for 6 to 8 to longer when they're in sports, even more hours.
And I think that's where every parent needs to think through the amount of peer interaction that their kid gets. Could it be that in general, in our culture, our kids are surrounded way too much by their peers? And so that's who they're most influenced by. They are most socialized by their often narcissistic peers. And so when they're in that environment every single day for 8 hours, and then throw on sports on top of that and weekend activities, and well, maybe that explains why a lot of our kids are so influenced by the world. And so we might need to rethink our strategy, which that kind of leads us to another objection, a big objection that we hear.
Always get.
Yeah, we always get this one. What about the socialization of your kids? And so this one is, I think, this one is, if we were to translate it, it's like, well, how do you keep your kids from being weirdos? Is what it amounts to. So here's the first question when we get this objection. the first response is a question like, what do you mean by socialization? And typically when I ask that clarification question, it's like, well, how are your kids going to learn how to get along with other people and stand in line when and wait their turn kind of thing. And so when that's what the concern is, it's like, oh, no, that's no problem. That's not a big concern at all because number one, they have siblings and they have siblings who they have to learn how to interact with all the time. And that force them to kind of put away their own selfish desires because they've got to sacrifice some of those for, the good of the house. And so just living in a house with other people allows plenty of that socialization. So all of that to say, the most important thing first is to clarify what someone means by socialization. And if it just is getting along with other people, no problem, because in a homeschool or home environment, you're doing that all the time. And then also, again, as Erin said, we don't keep our kids locked in the house. At sports, they get plenty of that. At church, in Sunday school with other kids, they get plenty of that. We take them to the store with us. I mean, we go all, we're all over the place. We're in the world. So they get that all of the time. So we're not worried about those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think underneath that question is what I talked about earlier, kind of my own prejudice that I had. I think you had it too, Kunkel, but you can pretend like you didn't.
I'm a little less judgmental than you.
But it's that aren't you afraid they're going to be weird because there's an assumption that homeschool kids are weird, and then of course there's not any public or private school kids that are weird.
Yeah.
It's just that. So I think sometimes the question comes from there, which I understand. And then also too, I think it comes from this assumption that because we homeschool our kids, they don't ever spend time with other children. It's always just at home.
Yeah. And I think what we've seen in modern homeschooling, that's just not the case. They're spending their time in co-ops and lots of different activity that enhance their education. But when it comes to the weird part, of course, nobody wants their kid to be ostracized. And thankfully, 3 out of our 4 kids who are homeschooled have turned out normal. I won't highlight which ones.
You couldn't be talking about the one behind the camera.
No, I know. I realize if I talk about him behind the camera, then he does edits to the videos that I might not like. So there's not only that. So, okay, yes, that's a concern. But I think you brought up, hey, here's a counterexample. Are there any kids who are in public education or private education who are socially awkward? Absolutely.
Well, yeah, actually, the story you said about science camp, and I mean, we could all of the adults listening most of us have gone to school, know the kids in our schools that were treated horribly because they were quote unquote weird or socially awkward. I mean, we know the kids are in the public school and private schools that are socially awkward, and they're the ones that, like you said, they're in the Darwinian evolution, survival of the fittest world. They are the ones who are at the bottom. Yeah.
But what that tells you is that it's not the method of schooling itself, because in public, in private, in homeschool, you have socially awkward kids. And often that's just a reflection of the families they grow up in.
Yeah.
Okay. And now some of you are like,
that's mean.
I hope I didn't offend anyone out there right now.
You 100%
well, my kid is socially awkward. I never thought myself.
Are you saying the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, typically. But what's okay is what's great about homeschooling is that not a whole lot of stock is put into that.
Yeah.
There's way too much stock put into that in these public or private school settings, because there's a whole hierarchy cool and value. I mean, it goes deeper. It's value that's placed on our kids based upon these kinds of things.
Yeah.
And so it's okay for us to be, people to be socially awkward. And that's not something that should give someone less value.
Yeah. And actually, I would say, I just want to add, if your kid is socially awkward or does struggle in some way like that, I'm remembering having a conversation with a gal that was talking to me about homeschooling, and she goes, yeah, but I just think it does seem like a lot of families whose kids are different homeschool. And I said, well, and what would be wrong with that? And I told her, I think it's completely justified for parents to protect their kids from what we just mentioned, because if you're going to put them in a system where they're going to be at the bottom and tortured relentlessly. I mean, I saw, especially in junior high and high school, some kids absolutely brutalized, teased because they were different. So if a parent is willing to save their kid and protect them from that, well, that's awesome. And a parent not only has every right to do that, probably should. So,
and that's appropriate protection.
Yes.
Because I'm just hearing an objection. Well, no, you need to put your kid through hard things and let them deal with hard things. And of course, that's our view. We believe that. In fact, we have a podcast on that. But there are some things that, no, you shouldn't put your kid through if you can protect them from it.
Well, yeah, there's a difference between bullying and just your kid having to work out like a relational problem or whatever. And I think we can't know the damage that it does to people's soul with some of the torture that some kids are put through. And I don't think we should take that lightly. Like, we really don't know. And this is why parenting requires wisdom, and why parents should always be the ones to make the decisions about their kids and what
know their kids
educational, because we don't know what will hurt our child and really cause, a scar for a lifetime. I mean, I recall things when I was a kid. I'm sure you do too. There are things that we just don't know. So if your instinct is to protect, I think culturally the push is we shouldn't.
Yeah.
But that instinct is a good instinct. Now, sometimes as parents, we need to be pushed to let our kids struggle in healthy ways. And that's not what we're talking about here.
Well, okay, so there's one last issue of socialization I want to hit on, and it's realizing that every kid is being socialized. And I think maybe the more important question isn't, hey, is your kid being socialized? It's, what is your kid being socialized to, or what are they being socialized by? This is where we as homeschooling parents like our odds when it comes to what our kids are being socialized by, because they're primarily being socialized by us, by mom and dad, and which we think is the proper authority. And we're able to protect them from being overly socialized by their peers, by narcissistic peers who are shaped by pop culture often. And then, not, of course, there are great kids out there. I mean, I've said that multiple times about these narcissistic kids, but there's some great kids out there. But we get to kind of oversee that socialization to something, and so they're being socialized by, we hope, mature adults who love the Lord, who have wisdom, who have certain priorities, versus not knowing maybe who their friends are and who they're being socialized, and what kid is pulling out on a phone and showing them on social media or whatever. So everyone's being socialized to something. And I'm not as concerned about my kid being up on the latest music videos or social media drama or reality TV show. Those kind of things, many of our young people are being socialized to. And so everyone's being socialized. What are they being socialized to and by?
Yeah. And again, just with homeschooling, you as a parent are more able to pick the groups and things that your kids are, besides your neighborhood where, the neighbors, but the activities that you get to pick and the time that your kids spend with the different families and that sort of thing. And that seems to me an appropriate role for a parent. Kids don't really have a lot of wisdom on picking good friends. Yeah. And so we can really help them more in that when they're younger, when they actually need that help. So,
well, there's a couple of benefits. I think let's end with a couple of the benefits, because sometimes we talk a lot about, the things we're protecting them from, or, let's keep them from this. But there are goods that have come with homeschooling. And one of them is just the closeness we've seen in our family with those kids. And we've seen that with other families as well. In fact, that was one of the things when we were considering homeschooling. I had a conversation with several different individuals, and it was parents, and it was also from the kids' perspective, some grown adults who had been in homeschooling, who mentioned this. And I remember I was on a plane flying to an event to speak somewhere, and sat next to a guy, and we struck up a conversation. And I don't know how he even got on education, but found out that he was they were part of a family that homeschooled their kids. And he said the best thing about it was that, his daughter now was in her 20s. And he said there was such a closeness between the mom and the dad and their daughter that he doesn't see in other families. And that really struck me. And then going through our own experience, I think with our oldest daughter in junior high, seeing that she was at a Christian school, but there was this environment that's fostered by the other students of pushing away the parent. And it was like, go to a social event or go to a parent night, and we, show up, and it's like, try to get away from your parent as much as possible. And it was like uncool. And what was being socialized in the kids was to kind of rip on your parents, move away from your parents, not in kind of a healthy, independent way, but in a very negative way. Mm-hmm. And so what you get socialized to think that's the norm, and that has to be that way. That your kid has to go through some kind of stage where they're not going to like you, and they want to push you away, and you're stupid, and it doesn't have to be that way. And we've seen that with our kids who were homeschooled. There is they don't get socialized into some of that stuff.
Yeah, the healthy pushing away, what you're talking about, or I guess we wouldn't say pushing away, but just the healthy growing in independence is so different than what you're describing. That situation is like push, and I think what's more common now in the culture is push parents away in that they're dumb and you can figure things out on your own. But at the same time, I've seen the pendulum swing that kids are less and less given responsibility. So there's more dependence on the parents to make their kids lunch, drive them to and from school, heaven forbid they walk, and do their laundry, you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. But then in the same time, there's a pushing away for anything that's cool or whatever. So it's just interesting that it's not like a healthy, hey, I'm becoming my own person here, and I'm becoming a young adult. And so there is that healthy of growing away from your parents that actually is supposed to happen.
Yeah, and so the closeness of family bonds is something that we think has been a benefit of homeschooling. And that alone is so valuable, because that's going to last for a lifetime. And so there's more we could say on that. But
yeah, I think the last thing we'll just say is the time that it has afforded, which lends to the closeness of our family, but also just the time that you're able to have, that your kids are able to have, to pursue things they enjoy doing. That was one thing we were able to contrast, since we had done public, private, and homeschooling with our kids. And then as we got into especially the older years, they weren't bogged down with homework, because you can accomplish more with one student than you can with 30 students moving around to different classrooms. You think about how much time is eaten up in a school environment that you don't have to eat up in a homeschool environment, and you're able to move at your own pace. And so we've seen in our own kids just the time that they've had to pursue interests as they get older, to have jobs, to spend more time doing things like that they enjoy, and to develop skills and all sorts of things like that. But just the time has been such a big benefit, and something definitely that we could contrast. Our oldest daughter, we never did homeschool her. So just to clarify, we kept her in public school, and then she did some private school too. But, the time that is expected of just a high school student when it comes to time at school, and then if they're in sports, and then homework time. Mm-hmm. A lot of high school students today can't have jobs because they just don't have the time to do it. And they can't spend time at home and do anything for anybody else because all their time is eaten up on stuff for themselves. So the time thing has been a huge benefit in all these years now of homeschooling that I think is so valuable. You don't get time back. And so the time together, the time for them to develop on their own, the time to pursue interests, all those things has just been really, really such a wonderful benefit.
Yeah, and another benefit I think has been just being able to make the Christian worldview and their Christian faith and scripture and their relationship with God so central to education. I mean, that is a central piece. And we've talked about this in one of our podcasts on morning time, but that has been so central. That really kind of everything revolves around that. And we have the freedom to do that. And so I think that's been another benefit of it. And so we're able to see our kids, their growth and their development beyond their peers. In their own knowledge of God and of their faith. So there are some really great benefits to it. So those are the various reasons why we decided to homeschool. It was a journey, and it's not always been perfect. It isn't always smooth, but there are some real good things that we've seen from it. And our long-term goal really deals with that objection about being salt and light. Our long-term goal for our kids is to send them back out into the culture, to be a powerful witness to the reality of Christ. And so for us and our family, this short-term kind of method of education, homeschooling, actually serves that longer, lifelong goal of having our kids be salt and light in the culture. Maven exists to help the next generation know truth, pursue goodness, and create beauty for the cause of Christ. To find out more, check out maventruth.com.